The first light of morning over the Jamaican cane country in 1807 did not arrive gently. It slid through the mist like a blade, cutting into the damp breath of the fields where sugar stalks stretched in endless rows. A glistening green sea feeding the empire's hunger. The air was thick with fermenting sweetness and ash from the night fires used to clear brush. And beneath this veneer of tropical beauty lay the silence that came after screams, the hush that followed every drum confiscated, every prayer whispered in patois beneath breath, every chain clink that marked time like a cruel clock. In the stillness before overseers' whistles split the morning, and before the turning gears of the boiling house coughed heat into the world, she stood alone at the river edge, palms resting against rough bark, eyes fixed on the violet sky that threatened rain but never gave mercy. They called her Adana in whispers, daughter returning home, though no home existed for her here. She was born in bondage on this soil, yet carried an ancestral memory not her own, a homeland she had never seen but felt in marrow, in rhythm. In the red clay dreams that visited her on nights the wind carried spirits from across the Atlantic. To the plantation ledger she was mere capital, a unit of labor valued for youth and strength, body assessed in pound sterling and usefulness, womb appraised for future children who could be worked or sold. But beneath coarse linen cloth her heartbeat remembered the women who had crossed saltwater in chains, yet refused to bow their spirits. She felt the ghosts of those who jumped into the sea rather than let their bodies harvest cane for foreign crowns, their refusal turning waves into graves of defiant sovereignty. And she breathed them in, knowing a reckoning was coming not only for her but for this island, for all its sugar fields and boiling houses that fed London's tea tables and fattened merchant fortunes, for every lash that cracked in the name of commerce and crown. A breeze rustled cane leaves like restless tongues, and she closed her eyes, knowing that soon the bell would ring and bodies would shuffle toward rows where machetes glinted and backs bent in endless motion, where sweat-salted wounds and flies hovered around scars that never healed. But before that, there was stillness, a breath the land seemed to hold as though the earth itself sensed the shift of fate approaching the Caribbean like a great tide. In London they argued over abolition, debating freedom as though it were a luxury fabric. Yet here blood already stained the soil with memories of Tacky's war, and whispered rumors of Haiti blew across the sea like embers seeking tinder. British law would forbid the trade this very year, but not slavery itself. Masters panicked over future labor supply, calculating new ways to extract life from bodies without replenishment from the ships, turning every enslaved womb into battlefield and investment portfolio. Adana understood this deeper than they imagined. For only days ago, beneath the humid cloak of night, she heard Master Cunnington's voice drifting like poison from his veranda, speaking not of sugar or barrels or markets but of bloodlines, heirs, and legacy. His wife had died the year prior from fever, leaving him with no legitimate offspring, no child to inherit the estate and its machinery of extraction, and so his ambitions settled on another path, sinister in its entitlement. He had forced himself upon an enslaved girl barely 14, believing that if the law forbade purchase of new bodies, he would create them in flesh and bondage through violation cloaked in power. The girl was still swollen with child, belly round as the sugar vats he oversaw, her eyes empty of childhood since that night, her future stolen like so many futures here. And Adana had sworn, not to anyone living, not aloud but to the wind, to the spirits, to the waters that remembered every soul ripped from homeland, that she would not let the plantation's future be built on violence born under night's silence. She moved toward the boiling house, not out of duty yet but instinct, her path quiet across damp soil. The building loomed, bricks blackened by heat, chimneys coughing smoke that stung eyes and lungs, boiling pans already warming as early laborers stirred slow molasses with long paddles. Watching sugar reduce in relentless fire, she inhaled the metallic edge of copper vats, the bitter sweetness of cane juice turning into gold for colonial wealth, the sour scent of ferment drifting from the rum distillery nearby. Every plank here whispered history. This was where bodies collapsed from heat stroke and were dragged aside to rot until someone remembered to bury them, where children worked in shadow to turn mills, their limbs at risk of crushing between wooden gears, where women like her hauled cane bundles twice their weight, because refusal meant whip or worse. This place devoured bodies and spat out wealth, yet every board creaked with the truth that it feared the very people whose sweat sustained it. No overseer was yet in sight. Early workers kept movements controlled, whispering prayers to ancestors while the master slept in his great house atop the hill. confident in the illusion that fear kept this land in check. But fear was a brittle chain, and Adana could feel its links cracking. She passed the row of vats, each one a cauldron of empire, thick brown syrup bubbling, steam rising, heat pressing against skin like punishment. The vats held not only sugar but the future of slave economies, molten wealth, the sweetness that financed ships, guns, fine linens, London mansions. And next to them a smaller barrel sat, warmed but still, waiting for refining, its surface calm and deceptively peaceful. She thought of the girl, Nia, asleep in the women's quarters under watch, swollen belly shifting with life made from violence. She thought of the child inside, a child who, if born, would inherit chains branded not by iron but by law and bloodline, owned from breath to grave. And she felt a shiver, not of fear but clarity. The estate believed it would anchor power in flesh, breeding its next generation of servitude. But she had seen what happened when a people refused destiny imposed by empire, stories of Hades spreading like sacred fire, whispered prayers turning to insurgent breath. And she realized the plantation feared more than rebellion of machetes. It feared rebellion of mothers who refused to birth its future. The sun crept higher. Overseers' whistles sliced dawn, voices barked orders, and enslaved bodies emerged from quarters, moving like waves across the fields. Machetes lifted with resignation and quiet steel. Adana joined the line as she always did, hands rough from cane stalks, back knowing each bend, rhythm as old as her life. Yet today the air felt different, charged. The white men spoke hurriedly about dispatches from England, about abolition debates and rumors that ships would soon stop bringing Africans. "We must protect what we already have," one overseer muttered, meaning bodies like hers. They did not know she listened. They rarely imagined the enslaved had ears for politics, minds for strategy, hearts for vengeance disguised as patience. But Adana heard every word, threading them into resolve. Hours passed in sweltering labor, cane stalks falling in cadence, sweat running into eyes, insects biting, hunger gnawing. Workers moved under sun's unforgiving glare, but beneath surface routine something smoldered, a hum of restlessness, anticipation. Grief turned into weapon. When noon bell rang and bodies staggered to meal sheds, she slipped away under pretense of fetching water. Steps quiet but purpose carved deep. She walked not toward the spring but back to the boiling house where heat shimmered like mirage and flies buzzed near spilled syrup. The smaller vat sat as before, warm and waiting. She rested her palm against its rim, feeling metal's heat radiate through skin, imagining liquid's depth inside, thick enough to swallow sound, hot enough to silence without blade. It was no weapon forged by men, but history had long shown that tools of empire could be turned against it. The boiling house meant to create sweetness could instead consume legacy. She did not rush. Time in bondage trained patience like armor. She waited until sound shifted, until workers moved away, until the overseer's heavy boots faded toward cane rows. Only then did she go to the women's quarters. Nia lay there half dozing, exhaustion carved into her face, belly rising with each breath like tide. Adana sat beside her, smoothing cloth near her hand, and for a long moment she simply studied the girl. Childhood left behind not by choice but by force. Innocence replaced by burden no one should bear. She remembered when Naya first arrived, sold from another estate after rumors she carried rebellious songs in her voice. She had been punished not for action but for potential. Now she carried another potential the master claimed as his own. Adana felt a dull ache, pity, rage, sisterhood, grief. She touched Naya's forehead gently, whispering blessings not born of church but of river and soil and ancestral tongues. Then when the girl's eyes fluttered closed again, she slid arms beneath her with reverence. Lifting slowly despite weight and strain. Lifting slowly despite weight and strain. Nia murmured but did not wake fully. Exhaustion sedated more effectively than any draft. Adana carried her carefully, step by step, each footfall heavy with fate but steady as though guided by unseen hands. Outside sun glared, birds shrieked, but she moved in stillness, sheltered by the strange calm that comes when the world chooses its moment to shift. She knew if she faltered here, punishment would be beyond death. The master's wrath would scorch the quarters, whips would sing, chains tighten. Yet fear did not shake her bones. Her ancestors had crossed oceans in irons. She could cross this yard in purpose. At the doorway of the boiling house, heat surged like desert wind, yet she stepped inside, shielding Nia's limp body from flames' reach. The vats bubbled, fire hissed, and her breath grew shallow, sweat forming instantly. She approached the smaller vat, the one not yet fully boiling but deep enough, hot enough. Carefully, she set Nia on the floor, supporting her back, brushing hair from her face. The girl stirred, confusion clouding her gaze, then realization, then a soft sound, a plea or acceptance or fear. But Adana held her gaze, offering something older than comfort, a promise that bondage would not claim another life's future. Nia's hand trembled, fingers gripping Adana's wrist. She did not cry out. Their eyes locked, and in that silent communion the plantation's illusion cracked. Then, with arms strong not from brutality but resilience, Adana lifted the girl once more and tipped her toward the vat, guiding her not as executioner but as liberator from a world that planned to carve slavery into her child's first breath. What happened next would ripple beyond walls and cane rows, beyond this morning, beyond 1807 itself, imprinting a story not of despair but defiance on Caribbean soil. And as Adana steadied her breath, ready to carry out what she had chosen, she knew history rarely recorded women like her, but the land remembered, the sugar remembered, and one day voices would rise to tell what the plantation tried to bury in syrup and steam. The moment suspended like a held breath, heat thick around her, air trembling with the syrup's slow boil beneath the surface. Yet just as her muscles tensed to complete the act, a sudden crack outside shattered silence, the sharp bark of an overseer's order, the thud of boots approaching too near, the harsh cadence of authority moving toward the boiling house. Instinct born from years of surviving cruelty froze her limbs, and in that instant between decision and consequence, she shifted, pulling Nia back to her chest, lowering her gently to the floor, shielding her from sight. They crouched in shadow behind stacked cane bundles as sweat slid down Adana's face, not from heat alone but from knowing that fate often hinged not on resolve but on timing. The overseer's voice thundered as he cursed a worker outside for stumbling, his footsteps heavy enough to rattle dust from rafters. Adana held her breath, one hand over Nia's mouth not to silence her but to keep hope quiet enough that danger passed unaware. The overseer entered briefly, glancing only to check fires and production vats, never imagining that rebellion could grow in silence between breaths. Then he was gone, leaving behind only echo and drifting ash. When his steps faded fully, Adana exhaled and Nia trembled against her, eyes wide with fear, confusion, and perhaps some instinctive recognition that she had been at the threshold between two worlds. Adana pressed her forehead to Nia's for a heartbeat, apology and promise woven into the gesture. This would not be rushed. The death she contemplated was not vengeance fueled by rage alone, but a sacrifice to deny an empire its future heir. Such acts required precision, timing, and witness. The land itself seemed to murmur, wait, so she rose quietly, lifting Nia once more but now moving toward the back exit where no eyes watched. Outside, she laid the girl near shade and dipped cloth in water trough to cool her brow. Laborers passed at distance, too consumed by midday fatigue to question why one woman knelt by another outside the boiling house. To them, exhaustion and illness were familiar shadows. One more fainting body raised no alarm. Nia slept again, and Adana whispered a vow to the earth beneath her knees. The child would not be born into chains, but the moment must be chosen by spirit, not interruption. The bell called her back to the fields, and she obeyed outwardly, though inside she moved in another world entirely, one where fate coiled tight like a cane rope dragged across skin. The afternoon sun scorched mercilessly as blades swung rhythmically, cutting stalks that sliced hands and arms, leaving sticky sap on wounds like nature's cruel salt. Each stroke of her machete felt heavier than the last, not from fatigue alone, but from the weight of the decision waiting like a second shadow at her heels. Around her, whispers rustled through the cane rows, not of her plan, for she had told no one, but of rumors blowing across the island like warm storm winds. English ships turning away from African ports, enslaved women being watched more closely in breeding age, talk that masters sought to tighten ownership through blood rather than trade. Some spoke quietly of Haiti, voices barely audible under labor's breath, of Toussaint's flame still glowing even after betrayal, of men and women who shattered plantations and declared that sugar fields could belong to the free. Overseers feared those whispers more than any machete strike, for ideas moved faster than patrols and did not bleed when beaten. When evening neared, clouds gathered heavy and purple on the horizon, holding thunder like judgment. Workers trudged back to quarters with muscles screaming and stomachs hollow, and once counted like cattle by torchlight, they collapsed in thatched rooms thick with sweat. bodies lying crowded as if survival required touch. Adana stayed near Nia, who stirred fitfully, moaning softly from pain in belly and spirit alike. Women gathered around instinctively, sisterhood forged in suffering stronger than chain iron. They rubbed her back gently, whispered herbs and poultices, songs from lands lost and languages hidden beneath enforced tongues. Their presence reminded Adana that resistance was not always war cry. Sometimes it was hand on spine, cool drink lifted to cracked lips, lullaby hummed when overseer's whip had left someone unable to sleep without tremor. But tonight their presence also reminded her of risk. If she acted, they could suffer retaliation, though they knew nothing. Yet slavery itself was retaliation for existence. Harm was their daily companion, regardless of choice. Silence weighed, but she kept her plan locked inside, knowing too many secrets shared under oppression died not from betrayal, but from torture, wringing truth from bone. Night settled thick, fireflies blinking like spirits watching from brush, frogs croaking near riverbank where roots twisted like ancient fingers. In the great house, lanterns glowed warm with luxury, while enslaved bodies huddled in heat without rest. The master dined alone tonight. Estate books spread before him, quill scratching calculations of yield, debt, value, future. Upstairs, a cradle had been dusted in anticipation, built by slave hands polished with oils stolen from their allotments, waiting for child conceived in violence. He fancied himself a patriarch, imagining his blood dripping into soil to seed generations of white dominion even without a legal wife. Rumor said he toasted the unborn with rum aged in barrels watched by the very men whose ancestors were chained in hulls of slaving ships that crossed Atlantic in storms and stench. Cruel irony was currency here. Those who built wealth tasted none. Adana did not sleep. Instead, she walked to river edge where moonlight shimmered cold silver on dark water, and there she knelt, dipping hands into current that slid smooth over fingers like cool breath after furnace heat. Water was memory here. Memory of middle passage, of baptisms forced and baptisms chosen, of women throwing newborns into waves to save them from slavery, not out of cruelty but love sharpened into impossible choice. She whispered to river spirits, asking guidance, not forgiveness. There was no sin in denying empire new flesh to break. She touched the surface 3 times, a number old as her ancestors, and when she rose, moon had shifted, clouds parted, and she felt clarity settle like weight lifted only to reveal path beneath. Back in quarters, Nia whimpered again, pain spiking through her ribs as child inside shifted. Birth approached faster than expected. Perhaps stress had hastened it. Perhaps nature aligned itself with intention. Older women recognized signs. One fetched cloth, another boiled water in hidden pot. Others prepared to midwife a child they feared for before it breathed. But Adana, watching their hurried motions, felt a sharp pang. If babe came vulnerable into world at dawn, the estate would have claim before she could act. Fate demanded precision. Now was moment. She moved like shadow, quiet and swift, murmuring that she would fetch herbs from brush to ease pain. They nodded, trusting her, unaware of deeper truth. She did not gather herbs. She gathered courage thick as sugar sap, steeling herself against cries she might hear, against weight of taking life born innocent but destined for cruelty. Life born innocent but destined for cruelty. She returned for Nia when most women were distracted preparing basin and rags. She lifted girl gently once more. Nia, in pain delirium, clung to her, trusting because trust was all she had left. Outside, night air clung humid, stars blurred behind haze of coming storm. Crickets sang like chorus of restless spirits. The path to boiling house lay half lit by moon and half swallowed in dark. She walked it measured, every step thudding with inevitability. Inside, fire still glowed low beneath vats to keep sugar warm overnight, steam curling in ghostly tendrils. The smaller vat where she had paused before now simmered more intensely, surface trembling faintly in quiet room. She laid Nia beside it gently, the girl's face contorted in another contraction, breath stuttering with pain, a soft cry escaping. Adana stroked her cheek once, tears burning behind her eyes but not falling. Tears were luxury she could not afford. Resolve must stay sharp like machete edge. Yet before final act she paused to honor. She spoke softly in tongue older than cane fields, calling ancestors to witness, asking river mothers to guide soul's passage. This was not murder in her heart. It was liberation twisted by brutality of world that offered no path softer than death. She remembered stories whispered by elders, of African queens who chose fire over capture, of women in mountains of Jamaica who stood with maroons and never let children fall into masters' hands, of spirits who freed by taking breath as gift rather than curse. She was continuation, not aberration. She believed history would understand even if record books never spoke her name. As she lifted Nia a final time, the young woman's eyes opened, clearing briefly through haze of agony. She looked at Adana not with fear but sorrowful knowing, as though somewhere deep instinct whispered truth. This world would not spare her child, and mercy sometimes came clothed in nightmare. Her lips parted, forming shape of plea or prayer, and Adana pressed her forehead to hers again, sharing breath, giving courage. Then she moved, steady and sure, lowering girl toward molten future denied. A faint gasp escaped, then silence swallowed sound, syrup swallowing flesh. Steam hissed like spirits crying and blessing at once. Adana closed eyes, holding vat rim until knuckles whitened, heart pounding so loud she feared it might summon overseers miles away. But night held her secret like womb holds seed. When act was complete and vat still again, she lowered herself to floor beside it, breath shallow, limbs trembling not from regret but from enormity of what she had done. She sat in quiet, letting heat wash over her skin, listening for any footstep. None came. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, promising storm, washing sky clean as if universe itself prepared baptism for land about to awaken under new truth. She rose slowly and walked back toward quarters, each step heavy as stone. In darkness she moved unseen, carrying absence like cloak. She slipped into hut just before lightning slashed sky. Women looked up briefly, then returned to tending basin, believing she still sought herbs. They did not yet know fate had already shifted. She lay down near wall but did not sleep. Rain began, soft at first, then pounding fierce, drumming on roof like war rhythm. She stared at ceiling, breathing slow, knowing morning would bring screams when absence discovered, knowing search parties would scour cane and river, blaming runaways or fever before truth trickled like syrup into master's awareness. Dawn would not be quiet. Yet she felt strange peace, heavy and terrible. The child would not be born to bondage. The master's legacy drowned in sugar, meant to sweeten world that never tasted the sweetness of liberty for her people. The plantation's future died quietly in boiling house under moonlight. And though storm raged outside, inside her soul stood still, waiting for reckoning she knew would come with sun. Dawn did not so much break as tear across the horizon, a violent rip of gray into gold. Storm clouds still bruising the edges of sky as roosters called through damp air heavy with the scent of wet cane and wood smoke. The plantation stirred slow at first, bodies rising sore and minds fogged, but a ripple of unease ran through the quarters even before the overseer's horn shrieked. Something in the air felt off, too still after the night's torrent, too sharp in its silence. Women moved to check on Nia, expecting groans of childbirth labor, perhaps arrival of midwifery cries. Instead, they found empty mat, linens untouched since hours prior, cool as earth. A hush fell, then confusion tightened throats. One called her name softly, then louder. Hands touched bedding again as if body might reappear through will alone. Panic flickered. A few thought she had staggered to latrine or to find help for labor. Yet Adana sat in corner, face calm as stone but pulse racing under skin. Knowing eyes would soon turn to her. One woman asked where she had gone after fetching herbs. Adana lifted gaze slow, voice steady, saying the girl had been resting when last she saw her. It was truth twisted only by omission, the kind of truth enslaved people learned to wield. For survival demanded words that walked blade's edge between concealment and credibility. The overseer's shout cut across yards before fear fully spread. Missing. The word cracked like whip. Men were already combing barracks, checking tools, counting bodies as if head count equaled control. Within minutes, dogs barked, their loud, eager yelps bursting like gunfire. Adana's stomach knotted, but her breath held steady outward. Workers exchanged glances, anxiety rising not because they knew what happened, but because disappearance was always dangerous. Runaways meant retaliation. Punishments meant example. No one leaves without mark, an older man muttered under breath, remembering iron branding for those caught. Some murmured prayers, others scanned faces as though one might show guilt like sweat. In slavery, suspicion became air, inhaled daily. A horn blast summoned field hands early. No breakfast portion distributed. Overseers gathered near great house, arguing under breath, boots grinding mud. The master emerged soon after, face pale under anger, hair unpowdered, dressing coat thrown on unevenly. He did not look like land's sovereign this morning, but like man hunted by fate he thought he controlled. He demanded counts again, voice rising rough. Someone mentioned Nia's absence. A murmur followed. She had been near delivery, she had no strength to run. The master's expression shifted, fear slicing into fury. He hissed that she must be found immediately, any helper punished. His voice cracked on word child, panic slipping through arrogance. For first time, power wavered. This child was not just lineage. It was proof to estate and law and empire that he could propagate ownership through blood, and now mother was gone. His fear hummed through humid morning like second thunder. Adana watched from line as search parties fanned out. Men with lanterns and dogs heading toward Cane, others toward river, some toward boiling house. She kept face impassive, but inside blood drummed heavy. Her limbs trembled faintly, not from regret but from closeness to discovery. She did not fear punishment for herself. Fear belonged to those who still expected justice from oppressors. No, she feared for others. Women who sat beside her last night, men who shared rations and scars. Slavery punished community for individual acts to suffocate courage. Yet the act had already been done. Repercussions could only follow. She straightened her spine, taking machete handed to her. They forced work even during search. Labor could not pause for human crisis. Plantations demanded time bled into sugar like sweat. Cane must still fall, even as shouts echoed across fields calling Nia's name like lost prayer. When dogs neared boiling house, Adana's chest tightened. She bent low, cutting cane, body moving with practiced rhythm, sweat mixing with morning residue. Dog scratched door, whining. Overseer kicked it open. Seconds stretched too slow. She imagined vat surface sticky still, imagined sweet smell masking truth. A cry rose from inside, not horrified yet, just frustrated command to search everywhere. Workers did not pause, though ears strained for tone that signaled discovery. Then a shift, a sharp gasp, low curse, sudden stillness. The world seemed to freeze. A man ran from boiling room, face ashen, calling for master. Adana did not lift head. When master strode past, boots splashing mud, she kept eyes on cane stalk in hand, though she felt heat of dread radiating from others. Screams tore through Sugar House moments later. Not word screams, but primal, animal. Ripped from man who discovered fate he never imagined for seed of his arrogance. Some workers flinched, though none dared show pity. Overseers rushed. Dogs barked frenzied. Someone retched outside from sight. Rumor spread faster than wagons could roll. Something found in syrup, something terrible. Whispered words slithered between rows. Body unborn, sugar devoured, master's bloodline dissolved into commodity. A shiver passed through enslaved ranks, mixture of horror, awe, fear, recognition. The boiling house had consumed not just flesh, but prophecy. Adana gripped her machete so tight, fingers numbed. She kept face blank, but eyes stung as relief and grief warred behind them. Blank, but eyes stung as relief and grief warred behind them. Punishment followed as storm follows lightning. Master staggered from boiling house, face twisted in madness, shirt sleeve stained where he leaned on vat rim. He screamed for answers, spittle flying. Who? He roared, voice cracking, demanding name. Demanding guilty stand forward. Silence answered, as heavy as sky before downpour. No one moved, no eyes rose. The enslaved knew collective shield. Silence as armor, as rebellion. A child ran through Cane Rows, frightened by noise. Mother snatched him back quick, knowing stray motion could draw attention deadly as bullet. Master's rage turned vicious. He ordered every woman searched, every man questioned. Overseers dragged people forward, beat first without questions. Whip snaps cracked like firecrackers across valley. A teenage boy cried out as lash tore back. His mother screamed, then was struck too. Crying spread, though mouths tried to hide it. Adana stood in line, heart hard stone. She watched cruelty unfold as though distance separated her soul from body. This was cost, she knew. Resistance always bled, but she did not regret act. Regret belonged to those who sought mercy from merciless systems. She only feared injustice toward others. Whipmaster approached Rose, eyes scanning faces for tremor, guilt, defiance. His gaze landed on Adana a moment only, shifted to others. She held breath until he moved on. She did not tremble. Years had trained composure like steel. But another woman, older, eyes clouded yet sharp with knowing, looked at her briefly. Just a flicker, recognition in shadow of glance. She said nothing. Solidarity lived in silence thicker than chains. Hours of violence followed. Master raged through yard. shouted that mother and unborn would have belonged to him, screamed that someone stole what was his. His voice broke near end, half sobbing not for human loss but for legacy denied. Workers forced to kneel in mud, whipped until nightcall almost came. Overseers tired before enslaved spirits did. No confession came. Plantation logic demanded culprit, but empire's worst fear was not one woman's hand. It was many women's silence. Evening fell heavy purple as torches lit yard. Bodies bruised, backs bleeding, stomachs empty from missed rations, yet a strange undercurrent moved through slave ranks. A stolen triumph buried deep under wounds. Adana washed stripes on another woman's back with water dipped from trough. Her own skin held only faint bruise from being shoved aside. Fortune or spirits shielded her that day, but she knew safety fragile. She moved quietly, tending, praying, steady. Nia's name whispered like invocation among women as they grieved in secret. Some cried softly, thinking child murdered. Others, those who understood horror of birthing bondage, whispered blessings for soul released before chains claimed breath. Adana said nothing, but tears fell finally in darkness, silent, hot, then wiped away fast. The great house remained lit all night. Master drank, raged, sobbed, called his unborn heir's name, though none had been chosen. Rum traveled among enslaved that he swore vengeance until island ground soaked red. But his power, shaken by loss, cracked. Enslaved saw vulnerability through rage, cruelty fueled by broken legacy. Tomorrow would bring harsher discipline, suspicion, increased surveillance. Yet rebellion seeds watered by fear thrive deeper. In quarters, women huddled close, humming mourning song older than fields they cut. Melody low, a lament for stolen youth, violated bodies, unborn destinies returned to ancestors. Adana sang under breath too, voice steady despite memory of Vat's heat still ghosting skin. She did not celebrate. This was not triumph. It was grief turned into shield, sorrow weaponized by necessity. She knew she would carry weight forever, but she also knew this plantation would never again believe its lineage guaranteed. She had pierced myth of white invincibility. Story would travel even in whispers. Sleep did not come. Rain dried, stars returned sharp. She sat outside hut, watching moon climb, feeling night air cool against lashes damp from tears no one saw. Crickets resumed chorus as though world swallowed violence and continued. But land remembered. She sensed it in earth beneath her feet. Ancestral hum, rhythm of survival. Murmur that her act joined lineage of women who carved freedom from cruelty's bone. Tomorrow pain would resume, sugar would boil, whips crack. But a future had been drowned in syrup, and empire tasted bitterness concealed in sweetness. She rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs, and whispered into night sky a vow. This was not end, only beginning tremor of island awakening. A single act in ocean of resistance rising like tide beyond reach of any master's command. The fourth movement of her story rises not in sudden fire, but in the long ache of waiting, the kind that presses into bone like the weight of humid air trapped under cane leaves before a storm. And by 1807 the island trembled with a tension that could not be spoken, aloud but throbbed through every plantation, yard and every cramped slave hut, because whispers of Parliament's debate in London drifted across the sea and then bled through merchant talk, through overseer complaints, through the muttered grumbling of planters who feared the horizon shifting, and enslaved people, though denied letters, read meaning in tone and silence in the restless tightening of planter patrols, and they sensed a world stirring just beyond reach. Yet emancipation was not law, not promise, only rumor, and rumor could be as dangerous as truth. For a rumor breeds hope, and hope inflames courage, and courage, when cornered without legal shield, often becomes rebellion, and rebellion on Jamaica's soil had a history soaked in blood, from Tacky's revolt to the whispered legends of Maroons who once carved sanctuaries in the mountains. She remembered those tales as she worked among boiling pans, feeling her heart quicken, not at the steam rising from sugar, but at the unspoken realization that time itself was turning, and like cane pressed to mill teeth, the old order strained under pressure it could not yet break, while enslaved women such as her measured every day between survival and quiet defiance, between caring for children and planning futures that law denied them. And in those weeks leading to her irreversible choice, the plantation felt like a theater where every breath, every glance, every stolen touch between kin carried a charge, as if the world paused, suspended and waiting. She had grown accustomed to reading danger like weather, noticing the slight flinch in an overseer's eye when a planter mentioned London, hearing the tense cadence when white men spoke of abolitionists as traitors, undermining the empire from within. And across the boiling house floor her fellow women felt the same electricity. They spoke softly over night fires about sailors saying slavery's days were numbered, about the governor's proclamations hinting reform without conceding freedom, about planters stockpiling muskets, and about the sudden increase in floggings for the slightest error in cane cutting or late arrival at the mill, punishments that betrayed panic more than discipline. She knew the masters feared not the law in London, but the souls they had tried to crush. Because fear is clearest when those who wield violence imagine it turned back upon them, and she saw the tremor of that fear in the plantation's tightened routines, in the overseer's insistence on checking every boiling pan, every ladle stroke as though vigilance could bind a shifting world. Yet beneath fear lay certainty, for the white men knew the economy that fed their sugar, rum, and imperial pride depended on bodies like hers, and if Parliament ended the trade, slave numbers would decline. Plantations would struggle to replace labor lost to disease, exhaustion, escape, and punishment, and so she reasoned with the bitter clarity of one whose life had been weighed in sugar barrels, that the plantation's future, its children, its heirs, its next overseers, represented the last insurance against loss, and that future walked on small legs through the yard, shielded and adored, fed sweet fruit while enslaved children starved for meat, and taught to view black life as toil and nothing more. Thus her eyes, when they drifted to the planter's youngest child, did not see innocence but a seed of continuity, a baton of cruelty poised to pass forward. At night she ran her fingers across scars on her forearm, tracing memories of punishments borne for protecting others, remembering when she had taken a lash in place of a younger girl who had spilled molasses, and she weighed the morality of what she contemplated not in Scripture. Scripture had been twisted by the master to justify chains, but in the raw ledger of suffering she had witnessed, in the stillbirths caused by forced labor, in the mothers who wept silently while holding children sold away, in the fevered dying who whispered regrets that they never struck back. If justice meant balance, then the scales had long been tipped so obscenely that one act, however stark, could not equal centuries of pain. Yet it could mark a refusal, a full-throated rejection of a future where the whip still sang. She did not imagine herself a martyr nor a heroine, but simply a woman cornered by time, faced with a choice between allowing another generation of white dominion to rise or severing a vine before it entwined another trunk. The conflict raged in her chest like fever, for she understood children are born without guilt. Yet she had watched how innocence dissolves when fed entitlement and tutored in command, and she remembered how the planter's older son, no more than 9, once struck an enslaved boy with a riding crop to amuse his father, who laughed, and in that moment she saw a prophecy written, not by God but by men. Morning after morning she listened to roosters crow across huts where enslaved families rose to labor, and each dawn felt heavier, as though fate pressed closer. The boiling house smelled of sweat and sweet steam, cane juice thickening under heat until it glazed the air, and her arm muscles burned as she stirred vats designed not only to refine sugar, but to discipline bodies through relentless pace. Above, on the catwalk, the overseer paced like a hawk, cane knife at his belt, barking orders when he sensed lag, and she hid her turmoil behind measured motions, never breaking rhythm. Knowing betrayal of emotion invited suspicion, and suspicion invited the whip, yet even in secrecy, her resolve sharpened like a knife honed against stone, shaped by every scream she'd heard echo from the whipping post, by every funeral mound she had whispered over at night. She thought often of coffles in Africa, of women like her stolen through trade that Parliament now debated ending, and she wondered if those women in their last free hours ever imagined a daughter of their lineage poised to make such a choice in a world forged by their captivity. There was no prophecy book for enslaved people, only memory and instinct told her that history shifts, not only through proclamations read in Parliament, but through hands that refused to accept imposed destiny. When the planter's wife began sending the youngest child to the boiling house to deliver messages and demand sweets from the enslaved workers, and indulgence taught as privilege, not curiosity. She noted each visit like a bead on a rosary, counting opportunity and risk. The child wore linen too fine for the sticky heat, hair curled by a mother's careful vanity, cheeks flushed with the arrogance of being born to power. Yet there were moments when the child's face softened, when a question hung in those blue eyes, when innocence flickered like a candle in wind. Each time she felt a pang, a tearing inside her that reminded her she too Once held a child at her breast before fever stole the infant, and the overseer forced her back to the fields before morning finished, and grief twisted into something harder, something that refused to bend. The child's small feet pattering across the boiling house floor became a rhythm she could not ignore, a reminder that the future marched forward even when the present still bled. Some of the other women saw her gaze linger and whispered among themselves, not in judgment but in wary recognition, because they knew that those who stare too long at fate often choose to shape it, and in their eyes flickered fear, not of her, but of consequences that would rain upon all should her thoughts turn to action. Meanwhile, word spread that Parliament's vote on abolishing the slave trade neared, and tension thickened across the island. Some plantations tightened patrols. Others conducted surprise searches of worker huts for weapons, and preachers brought in by planters sermonized obedience more fervently, as though piety could tide over looming transformation. Yet in the slave quarters beneath night sky, families whispered prayers not for patience but for freedom, imagining ships no longer carrying chains across the Middle Passage, imagining children not ripped from mothers at auction blocks. She listened to those prayers, letting them seep into her consciousness, fueling her understanding that cycles break only when someone acts, that waiting for mercy from those who profit from cruelty is a fool's hope. The moon waxed and waned, and in each lunar shift she saw time closing around her like a snare, pushing her toward the brink of decision. She sharpened her awareness, watched how cane carts rolled, how the vat ladders were placed, how quickly one could fall unnoticed into the viscous syrup where screams would muffle under heat and bubbles, and she hated herself for knowing such things. Yet hate did not deter her, it clarified purpose. Moral certainty in enslaved life was not a luxury but a weapon forged from necessity, and she held it tight. As the day of decision approached, she found herself moving with a strange calm, performing tasks with precision, eyes lowered yet senses heightened. She noted the overseer's fatigue after a night drinking with the planter, saw how the wife planned a midday nap to escape the heat, and recognized these alignments as forces converging. The world outside carried on, cane stalks rustling in trade winds, ocean waves pounding distant cliffs, maroons hidden in hills plotting their own paths, but inside her a storm hardened. She thought of the millions lost in the Atlantic, unnamed ancestors whose bones lay beneath waves, and she felt them crowd her chest, urging her not toward revenge but toward rupture, a tearing of the thread that bound future cruelty to present power. She imagined the sugar vats as cauldrons not only of labor but of empire, boiling the wealth that financed London's marble halls, and she realized that one act could contaminate that wealth with truth. The truth that enslaved bodies, not benevolent planters, powered empire. And if empire feared anything, it was exposure, and the possibility that cruelty could be answered. Her hands trembled the night before, not from fear of punishment, she had long accepted the risk of death, but from the enormity of altering fate. She watched stars smear across tropical sky, smelled wood smoke drifting from huts where children slept against their mothers, and she knew that what she intended could cost others. Yet she believed cost already lived in every breath they drew. Every hour bent beneath cane sun, she knelt in soil, fingers digging into earth like roots, seeking strength, and she whispered, not in prayer to the Master's God but to ancestors, to soil, to sea, that if history remembers nothing else of her life, it would remember she did not bow in the moment when bowing meant surrender of generations. Sunrise found her calmer, almost serene as though resolution lifted weight from her spine, and when she stepped into the boiling house the air shimmered with heat, machinery clanked, and the future felt like a taut rope ready to snap, and she was ready to cut it herself. Knowing history rarely grants women like her the grace of being named, but she carried within her the certainty that unnamed does not mean unseen, and unseen does not mean powerless. And as the child's footsteps approached that day, soft and unaware she steadied her breath, poised between the world that was and the world that could be shattered open. The moment did not erupt like thunder. It unfolded with the suffocating quiet of a humid morning where breath sticks and time slows, each detail printed sharply as if the world wanted her to remember it forever. Not as legend or vengeance, but as the precise truth of a woman pushed to the edge of history. The boiling house breathed heavy with heat, steam trembling up from copper vats, wooden paddles scraping sides in a rhythm older than her captivity, older than this cane field carved from soil where Tino bones slept. She stood at her station, skin damp, jaw clenched, heartbeat steady not because she felt no fear but because fear had long ago become a constant companion. no more alarming than sweat or hunger, or the hum of flies that gathered on spilled syrup. The child wandered in, pale legs dusted from yard play, clutching a wooden toy carved not by love but by command, a tiny horse polished smooth by privilege. Each footstep on stone echoed inside her ribs, and she did not move, not yet. Not until the moment aligned like a star crossing another, because hesitation was danger and haste was ruin. She waited for the overseer's eyes to turn, for his attention to shift toward a worker struggling to lift a bucket. And when it did, the world contracted into a single breath. She took one step forward, then another, gentle enough not to startle, guiding the child as if to show something interesting. Workers nearby saw her hand and recognized the gesture as protective, not aggressive, because enslaved women had spent lifetimes guiding, carrying, shielding white children who grew into their oppressors. The child giggled, trusting, innocence balancing at the edge of a world that had not yet carved cruelty into its bones, and for a brief second her throat tightened with grief, remembering her own lost baby, remembering how small heads smell of milk and possibility. But memory did not soften her resolve. It sharpened it. She thought of the lash scars, of the hollow wails of mothers robbed of children who did not return. She remembered the planter boasting that his youngest would one day run this estate, breed profit, straighten these people with firm discipline. She felt the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders like mill wheels grinding cane. So she did not pray, did not whisper farewell. She simply moved with a terrible, anguished clarity, and in one smooth, decisive sweep pushed the child forward. Not violently, but with firm inevitability, a momentum guided by history itself. Feet slipped, arms flailed, not in understanding, only in surprise, and then the small body tipped into the churning, seething molasses. The scream that followed was not sound, but a physical vibration, a tear through the air, cut short as boiling syrup swallowed breath and voice. Workers froze, shock rippling through them, hands suspended mid-stir, eyes widening not in disbelief but in recognition of catastrophe. No one lunged to save the child, not because they were cruel but because the moment happened too fast and because instinct told them that burning sugar would kill anyone who tried. The overseer turned, confusion curdling into horror, and she backed away from the vat, sweat chilling on her skin as if cold wind had slashed through the steaming house. She did not flee. She did not hide. She simply stood there watching the surface bubble, her face a mask carved by centuries of silence breaking inside her. No triumphant gleam, no satisfaction, only a hollow steadiness. Around her the world exploded into motion, shouts, frantic running. A bucket dropped and clattering like a gunshot, and she felt time slow again. Not mercifully but cruelly, forcing her to witness every second. Women nearest her stared with wide, aching eyes, not condemning, not applauding, but haunted by the knowledge that something irreversible had taken place, something that once imagined could not easily be forgotten. They saw not a monster but a mirror, a flicker of the rage and despair they had buried to survive. Some trembled, some swallowed hard. A few looked down at their feet, frightened not only of white retaliation but of confronting what might also live inside themselves if pushed far enough. She did not speak, for words would have been useless. All language had been exhausted in pleas to indifferent masters, in cries over graves, in whispered plans that never found fruition. Silence was the only truth left. The overseer, roaring now, rushed toward the vat, but the heat drove him back, and panic twisted his face into something grotesque. One worker tried to pull him away, muttering about the vat's danger, and she could almost feel the worker's internal battle. Fear for their own life colliding with the instinct to shield her. It was pointless. There would be no shielding now. The plantation house door slammed open across the yard, and she heard the planter's voice break into the morning with a desperate, high-pitched terror she had never heard before, not even when hurricanes tore roofs or fever swept the slave quarters. His wife followed, skirts lifted, hair loosened from its careful pins, and when she saw the scene, time fractured again. The mother's scream split the air sharp as cane knife on bone, a sound not unlike the wails she and other enslaved mothers had cried, but unlike theirs, this scream summoned force, not pity. Rage and horror crashed together, forming a storm that shook the air. Men ran to restrain her as she clawed toward the boiling house. The planter staggered forward, voice cracking with disbelief, choking on grief and rage, and in that moment, she saw something like humanity in his face, a twisted, anguished human grief, but it passed quickly, swallowed by the realization of power threatened and lineage severed. Hands seized her arms then, rough, furious, jerking her back away from the vat as if she might dive in after the child or, worse, harm another white body. She did not struggle. Resisting would give them an excuse to break her bones before the inevitable. Her stillness unnerved the men holding her, as though they expected madness but instead found the calm of someone who had already crossed the threshold of consequence. One overseer hissed at her, spit flying, but she kept her gaze forward, not defiantly but fixed, like someone looking into a future already decided. The wife collapsed outside, wailing like a creature wounded unto death, and part of her, some buried surviving part, recognized that agony and felt its gravity. They would call her monstrous, and history, written by those who held power, might echo that judgment, yet in her heart she knew the truth. She had not killed innocents for anger, but attempted to kill a legacy that built itself on her people's bones. The other enslaved workers felt a strange mixture of dread and awe settle into their marrow. Some whispered prayers, fearing retribution like an oncoming storm they could not outrun. Others glanced at her with a fragile kind of respect, not because they endorsed the act, but because they understood the despair that forged it. In the yard beyond, the plantation's rhythm shattered. Chickens scattered, horses snorted in alarm, sugar carts halted mid-roll. It was as if the land itself paused, stunned by what had occurred. Across the fields, cane rustled under wind, indifferent yet eerily synchronized with the shift in human fate. She felt the sun climb higher, burning her damp skin, but she did not blink. Sweat trickled down her temples like tears she refused. Someone bound her wrists with a rope so tight it bit skin, and she did not resist. Pain meant little now. Everything meaningful had already bled out from her. They dragged her outside into blinding light, and the sky looked impossibly blue, mocking with its beauty. The mother's sobs tore into the air, each sound heavy, echoed by the planter's curses. He demanded her death. Not through law, not through trial, but with the ferocity of a man betrayed by the universe itself. He shouted that she would suffer, that no torment would match this loss. She listened, feeling neither pride nor regret, only a solemn certainty. Suffering was currency she had paid all her life. Inflicting it upon her now changed nothing fundamental about the order of the world. She was pushed to her knees, dust filling her nose, and she breathed deeply as if savoring earth one last time. She wondered whether her ancestors had knelt like this in battle or in ceremony, whether they had faced death with this same weight and clarity. The overseer raised his whip not to punish but to mark her. To begin a ritual of brutality meant to restore a hierarchy she had cracked. Every enslaved person in sight watched, breath held, hearts pounding. They did not speak, for silence was their only shield. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight, yet unable to forget the act they had witnessed. A few felt a strange uplift in their chests, a dangerous flutter of hope mixed with horror. Not hope for themselves, but hope that even in bondage, the world could still be defied. Hope like that was perilous. It had drowned rebellions and fed gallows before, yet it lived stubborn, impossible to extinguish fully. When the whip struck her back with a crack that sounded like a tree splitting, she inhaled sharply, not from pain but from the confirmation that her life would be measured now in blows. Until it ended, she did not scream. She would not grant them that satisfaction, nor dishonor the grief of those whose loss had led to this moment. Blood warmed her skin under the tropical sun, trickling into the dust, and she thought not of punishment but of soil. Every drop of blood enslaved bodies had given this earth had fertilized cane, that sweetened distant tables. Now her blood mingled with ground not as labor but as resistance. She wondered if the land felt different receiving it. The whip fell again and again, the overseer shouting, his fury fueled not only by the act but by the threat it represented. A reminder that dominion was never absolute, that even the most oppressed could disrupt empire. Through the haze of pain she heard murmurs from enslaved women, low, mournful hums, not celebrating but witnessing, holding dignity for her when she could not. The planter eventually ordered she be dragged away to await further punishment once law arrived. For even in rage he feared acting outside the semblance of legality now that Parliament whispered of reform. They hauled her like cargo and she allowed it, body limp, not in surrender but in acceptance. As they pulled her toward a shed, she gazed across the plantation, eyes tracing rows of cane shimmering in the heat. Children played in the distance, mothers worked silently, men hauled loads under sun that did not relent. Life continued, indifferent yet forever altered. She knew she would likely die soon, by torture, by hanging, by slow starvation in a cell. She did not romanticize it. She did not imagine songs or heroic whispers. She only hoped that her act would not drown in silence, that someone somewhere would speak her name, not as monster or martyr, but as woman. A woman who saw the wheel of suffering turning and chose to break a spoke, rather than watch it crush another generation. In her aching, bleeding stillness, she felt a truth pulse through her. A single act cannot free a people, but a single refusal can mark the beginning of a crack in empire's wall. And cracks, once formed, rarely stay small. The shed they thrust her into was not a cell, but a holding space between agony and sentence, a crude timber box where sunlight slipped only in thin, uneven slits and dust drifted like restless spirits in the beams. Rope still gnawed her wrists, blood drying in stiff streaks along her arms. The iron taste of her own sweat coated her tongue, The door slammed, reverberating like a drum announcing doom, and outside she heard feet pounding, voices rising, the plantation convulsing with grief, fury, fear. Inside, she sat in a corner on packed earth, and for the first time since the child's fall, she allowed her breath to stagger, not with regret, but with the weight of what she had set into motion. She did not cry. She had long ago learned tears were a luxury enslaved women rarely found time or safety to indulge. But deep inside, a tremor moved like a tide shifting, not weakness but exhaustion layered with ancient sorrow. Outside, the crickets hummed, absurd in their indifference, and the air smelled faintly of crushed cane and smoke from boiling fires that continued, because sugar's hunger never paused for tragedy. Time, though fractured, did not stop. It simply slowed enough for her to feel every inch of her aching body, every bruise, every memory that rose like ghosts summoned by pain. Her mind traveled backwards. Not to justify the act, she did not waste breath on justification, but to trace the path life carved to bring her here. She remembered the ship's belly, the suffocation of wood and chains, the cries of girls barely old enough to braid their hair, the stench of suffering pressed into planks. She remembered the auction block, the false smiles the traders forced slaves to wear as planters inspected teeth like horse merchants. She remembered the first labor in cane fields, skin slashed by leaves sharp as humiliation, the sun merciless, overseers' voices barking commands in a language that flayed dignity. She remembered the birth of her child, the fragile warmth of a newborn pressed to her breast, the illusion that motherhood might offer a pocket of humanity in a world hell-bent on erasing it. She remembered the sickness that came without mercy, the fever that stiffened tiny limbs, the burial at night with no coffin, only cloth and whispered grief. And then the overseer pulling her back to work before dawn, telling her suffering had no place on a plantation ledger. That moment, she realized, had planted the seed, not vengeance, worse, a clarity that life under bondage existed only to maintain the future of those who bought and bred power. The child she had lost would never be allowed a future. The child she had pushed had been promised everything. One life was grief, the other was guarantee. Her act, she realized, had not been sudden but years old. Outside, men's voices argued, some calling for her immediate execution, some for restraint until authorities arrived, some muttering about abolitionists in England who would twist this into ammunition. This island, like her veins, pulsed with tension. She pressed her ear to the wooden wall and heard hooves, a rider sent to summon magistrates. She listened to the planter sobbing, not quietly but like a wounded animal whose world had ruptured. She imagined his face warped in grief, and instead of satisfaction, she felt a hollowness, a dry ache like drought in soil. The world had taught her suffering did not balance scales. It simply echoed. But she also knew his agony would be heard by courts, by newspapers, by parliament if he wished. Her suffering, her years of invisible wounds, her child's grave were part of a silent ledger no law acknowledged. In that imbalance lay the truth she had acted against. Power mourns loudly. The enslaved mourned silently. She had ruptured that silence in the most unforgivable way. Hours passed. The heat inside the shed thickened, tight as a fist around her lungs. She leaned her head against rough boards, letting splinters prick her skin like reminders that she was still alive, still present in this moment, not erased yet. Through the slits in the wood, she saw the yard turning red gold under evening light, long shadows stretching from trees where birds perched, unaware or uncaring that a human life hovered between breath and memory. The plantation's machinery had slowed but not stopped. Sugar vats hissed, cane carts creaked. Empire did not pause for tragedy. The world that consumed sweet crystals demanded their production even as rage and mourning rippled across this patch of earth. Workers moved with tense shoulders, whispering in patois and low English, glancing toward the shed with fear, pity, awe. Some nodded to themselves as if memorizing her face, committing her to a lineage of resistance. Others kept their eyes down, not in judgment but in self-preservation. Survival demanded silence more often than bravery. Night crept in. The light dimmed until only moon slivers pierced the cracks. Frogs croaked, insects chattered, the island breathing its nocturnal rhythm while she waited. Pain pulsed slow in her back, each wound a throb of memory. And she counted them not for martyrdom but to stay rooted in flesh. For sometimes after great acts the mind threatens to float, to seek escape in dream or madness. She refused escape. She would remain fully conscious, fully responsible. Her muscles twitched and hunger gnawed. But she did not ask for food or water when footsteps approached with a gourd. The guard placed it near the door and retreated quickly, as if proximity to her would curse him. She drank anyway, throat burning, water tasting like metal and fear, and then sat upright again, spine rigid, determined to face dawn as a woman, not a cowering thing. In stillness she imagined the future. Not her own. She doubted she had more than days, perhaps hours, if anger flared again. She imagined other plantations, other enslaved women hearing rumor of her act. Some would recoil in horror, some would weep in understanding. Some might whisper her name in corners, not as encouragement to replicate violence, but as proof that bondage could crack. She did not desire to be symbol. Symbols are stolen by those who write history. She only wanted truth, that she had acted not out of madness, but out of a reason sharpened by suffering, and by the cold knowledge that sometimes violence is not born from cruelty, but from refusal to surrender dignity. And she knew those who judged her most harshly would never understand this distinction, because their world was built on violence, and yet defined only theirs as righteous. Sleep did not come, but dawn did. It seeped through the slits like thin fire, warming her swollen skin. Roosters crowed. Drums sounded faintly from maroon hills far beyond plantation boundaries. She could not see them, but she felt their beat like a pulse through soil. Birds began their morning calls. She heard chains rattling outside, not for her yet, but for others preparing to march to field. Enslaved life continued its grim march even as doom hovered over her. When the door opened, overseers stepped in cautiously, muskets slung, whips coiled, as if she might spring at them despite her bound wrists. She stood slowly, no trembling now. The sun behind them cast their figures in stark silhouette, and she walked forward without needing to be dragged. One man spat at her feet. Another crossed himself. They led her out into blazing light where the planter waited hollow-eyed. His grief turned hard and vengeful overnight. His wife supported by servants, face pale, eyes gone sharp with a hate that felt ancient and personal. She met their gazes without defiance, only truth. They expected madness or remorse. What they saw instead was stillness and unbroken presence. They shackled her ankles, though she did not resist. They bound her elbows to prevent her from lifting arms in future struggle. She walked with the slow dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose, only the power of how she would meet death. The enslaved community watched from a distance, faces taut, some expressionless to avoid punishment, others barely holding grief or admiration inside their eyes. No one spoke. Sound itself seemed forbidden. The planter announced she would be taken to Spanish Town to stand trial. Not mercy, but spectacle, to prove white law governed even here. He declared she would hang, and enslaved mothers clutched their children tighter as if wind had chilled suddenly under the Caribbean sun. They loaded her into a cart. The wheels creaked. Dust lifted around her feet. As the cart moved, she felt her body sway with each bump, yet her mind remained steady. Cane fields blurred by, green and gold waves whispering secrets of all who had bent under their blades. She thought of the child again, not as enemy, not as victim, but as life caught between worlds built by cruelty. Her heart hurt, not with regret for the act, but with sorrow for the world that made such a choice possible. She did not delude herself into thinking she had ended plantation cruelty. She had only interrupted one thread, but sometimes interruption is all a human soul can offer. She lifted her face to the rising sun, letting heat wash over her wounds, and breathed deep. Let them judge. Let them kill. Her act had already entered the bloodstream of the island. A story that would not remain where they placed her body. And as the cart rolled toward judgment, she held a final thought like a palmful of embers. History forgets many names, but it never forgets a breach in power, and she had become one.